Hello and welcome to a Valentine's Day special edition of Craig Biddle Live. Thanks for joining me. Today I want to talk about one of the most important and most underappreciated values in human life, and that is sex for pleasure. Now, why do I say that this is underappreciated? Doesn't everyone love sex for pleasure? Well, unfortunately, no. And the reason is that we're taught not to love sex for pleasure. This isn't to say that people don't have pleasure when they have sex, but we don't treat sex for pleasure as the kind of value that it genuinely is in life and that it ought to be in our own lives. And the reason for this is multifold. I'm going to focus on a couple of the essentials today. One of the main reasons that we don't treat sex for pleasure as the value it is and pursue it in the way that we would if we did treat it that way is because most of us, if not the vast majority of us, are raised in a religious environment of some sort. And according to the three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, sex for pleasure is frequently frowned upon. Why is it, for instance, that priests are supposed to remain celibate? It's because sex it's not just sex for pleasure; it's any kind of sex, but is sort of a low and it's beneath the dignity of a perfect man. So it's for imperfect people. It's for people who are morally incapable of keeping themselves from following their desires. And so we hear very frequently from various religious sources, whether it's the Bible or various religious doctrines or sects, that sex is not supposed to be enjoyed. Sex is primarily for procreation, and it is not something that you should indulge in. So if to the extent that you're going to involve yourself in it, you should A, be married, and B, you should be seeking to have children. That's the purpose of sex. There's another view of sex that's even, in my estimate, more awful than that, and that is the Kantian view of sex. The philosopher Immanuel Kant held that when you engage in sex, you're using someone else as you're using someone else as a means to your end, to your selfish end, namely pleasure. And the other person is using you as a means to his or her selfish end, pleasure as well. And according to Kant, this makes you not merely an animal, but a sub-animal. And he reasoned that because animals at least have the excuse of not being able to control themselves or stop themselves from pursuing their appetites, their sexual appetites, we are able to refrain from doing that. So when we do engage, when we do indulge, we are sub-animal for doing so. So these ideas, these kinds of ideas float around the culture, particularly the religious ideas that sex is base and it's something that should only be done really for procreation. And there are degrees within religions about how they handle this. Judaism is far less strict on these kinds of things than are Christianity and Islam, and certain sects within Christianity are worse than others, and so on. But there's this overall flavor or tenor, if you will, in the religious environment that sex is not for pleasure. It's not something that you should engage in just for the purpose of enjoying yourself. Well, what are the other views in the culture? If not that, if not this sort of dogmatic, you shouldn't enjoy sex, we have, on the other hand, and this is frequently probably one of the more popular kinds of ideas about sex, certainly among younger generations, is that sex is a non-rational endeavor. So it's just all about feelings. This is sort of the subjectivist or moral relativist view of sex. The idea that sex is not something that you can rationally analyze or rationally think about. It's all about just going with your feelings, doing what you feel like, have sex with whomever you feel like, whenever you feel like. There are no standards involved here. Just do whatever you want, go with your gut. And so the idea here is, if you go out to a bar and you meet some girl or guy who's sufficiently drunk to just say, hey, let's go home and have sex, and you go home and have sex, that this sex is just as good as any other kind of sex. All sex is equally subjective, feeling-based, and sort of animalistic, if you will. And the subjectivists embrace the animal side. They would say to Kant, that's right, we are being animals, and we like it. That's what we're going to do. So these are kind of, and I'm pushing the limits on the extremes of these views, and most of the views are somewhat moderated relative to these. But this is the general idea out there in the culture about what sex is all about. Well, I ask you, can you enjoy sex to the hilt if you think that you're engaging in something for pleasure that you shouldn't be engaging in for pleasure? And can you enjoy sex to the hilt if you have completely pushed out of the activity, out of the engagement, any values based on rational thinking about what matters to you, about the character of the other person, about who it is you're engaging with? If it's just some girl who happens to look good in this miniskirt, and so you're going to take her home, is that sex going to be the same as the kind of sex that you would have with someone who you were madly in love with and shared values with, and shared a sense of humor and shared a view of art and loved the same kind of music and had all of these experiences? Are these the same kind of thing? Do you gain the same kind of joy, of pleasure from sex in both cases? I think you can see that you don't. So I want to turn to a rational view of sex, a view that does not say sex is a bad thing. It says sex is a good thing. But it also says that sex is something that should be thought very carefully about and entered to in a rational way with respect to the kinds of animals that we are. Yes, we are animals, but we're rational animals, which means we're beings who survive by means of reason and whose basic means of knowledge is reason. Our only means of knowledge is reason. And so what we want to do to achieve the greatest amount of pleasure in sex is use our rational faculty to figure out what is it that we need based on the kind of body and mind integrated being that we are. What is it that we need to do in terms of sex to make sex as pleasurable as it can be? Before I get all the way into the details on that, I want to just point out that I'm operating here off of a standard of value that is completely different from the religious and the subjectivist and the Kantian standard of value. So the standard of value that I'm operating off of here is the idea that life, man's life, the requirements of a human being's life, given the kind of animal that he is the standard of value. So that which advances, promotes, enhances the life of a rational being is good, and that which harms or destroys the life of a rational being is bad or evil. So this is the sort of black and white standard that I'm working with. I'm not, this is quite different from the biblical or the religious standard that the standard of value is religious scripture or faith or revelation, and it's different from the subjectivist standard that the standard of value is your feelings or whatever your gut tells you to do or your whims of the day. The idea here is no, we should step back and say, what kind of being are we, and what do we need based on our physical and psychological needs, not only for a moment or day, but for the span of our lifetime. So this is a long-range, broad-range view of what human beings are. It's a rational view of what human beings are. It's looking at the facts. Given that standard of value, where does sex for pleasure fall in here, and what is exactly going on when people do have sex for pleasure? Well, the first thing to say is that sex for pleasure under this standard, the standard being the requirements of life and happiness for the life of a rational being, sex for pleasure is good. It's a good thing. It fills our life with joy, and we should engage in it. However, we should engage in it in a rational way so that we get the most out of it. Like I said earlier, there's a difference in the kind of pleasure you get from sleeping with somebody you met at a bar who was just drunk enough to be willing to go home with you, versus sleeping with someone and engaging in wonderful sex with someone whom you love or at least greatly admire and desire, based on spiritual values, based on the kind of person that this person is and the kind of values that you have. So the rational view of sex that I'm talking about holds that sex is good and that we should approach it very carefully. We should say to ourselves, what is it that makes sex wonderful? And a good way to answer this is to look at the fact that when people engage in sex for pleasure, and this includes the people who sort of do it on the subjectivist end, just going to a bar to pick somebody up and go home and have sex, they're after pleasure there. But they're not getting the same kind of pleasure as a person who is either madly in love with somebody or at least greatly admires and desires the person he's sleeping with based on values. And if you've had these two different kinds of sex, you know firsthand what I'm talking about. There's a difference between these. Well, what is the difference that makes the difference here? The difference that makes the difference here is the kind of spiritual engagement, the kind of spiritual involvement that arises when you engage with somebody based on mutual values. Not just physical values, not just you look good, so I want to take you home, but what kind of person are you? What matters to you? What have you accomplished? What have you done? What do you find humorous? What do you love in art? What do you love to talk about? We're rational, conceptual beings, and what makes us enjoy values the most is when those values engage in our minds in a conceptual way. Sex is a deeply spiritual activity. It is not the same thing as the taste of ice cream on your tongue. It's not a purely perceptual pleasure. It is a highly conceptual pleasure. It's a pleasure that involves your emotional faculty, your conceptual faculty, your whole being, your body and your mind, your matter and your spirit, your physical self and your psychological self. And if you think of sex this way, and if you can push aside all of the religious nonsense that has been pushed on people since the day we could listen, about sex being base and something you should only do when you're married and all that, and we'll get to that more about marriage and fornication in a minute. If you can push that out of your mind and focus on sex as the thing it is, the purpose it serves in human life, which is to help us to celebrate ourselves and life with another person who we either love or deeply admire. And when you approach sex that way, the kind of sex that you have is orders of magnitude more pleasurable. It's so much more pleasurable that it's really a different kind of thing altogether. And this is what I encourage you to do. I encourage you to think about sex this way. Get rid of the religious dogmatic ideas on sex. Push away the subjectivist, relativist nonsense that it doesn't matter who you sleep with as long as you find the person physically attractive, and just kind of go with your gut for the moment. And instead say, what kind of a being am I? And what kind of an approach to sex makes sense given the kind of being that I am? And if you do approach this sex this way, you really will achieve a completely different kind and degree of pleasure. Now, I want to say a few words about four things, actually. I want to talk about a little bit about monogamy, fornication, experimentation, and then finally how to make your sex life really awesome. So, given what I've been saying, does this imply somehow that you should be monogamous, that monogamy is inherent in this moral approach to sex? Absolutely not. Monogamy is a choice. You can choose to be monogamous or not. And if you're going to be monogamous and you're going to make that commitment with someone, then you should be monogamous. If you make a commitment, you should keep that commitment unless you want to discuss it and reevaluate. And if you're married and you've decided to be monogamous and stay married, that's great. If your marriage starts to collapse and you want to get a divorce, fine, get a divorce. But I'm certainly against. I think morality and integrity and honesty are against the idea of marital affairs or any kind of an affair if there's an agreement that there's going to be monogamy. So not everyone wants to get married. Not everybody should get married. If you don't think you can or want to engage in that kind of a long-term relationship, don't get married. So religion would say that you therefore shouldn't have sex because you're not married. Well, that's ridiculous. Sex is one of the most important and beautiful aspects of life and one of the most pleasurable things that we can ever experience. So if you don't want to be monogamous, fine, but make that clear to the people who you engage with sexually. They deserve to know that. I want to talk a little bit about fornication, the idea of having sex before marriage or apart from marriage. Religions, the three major monotheistic religions, are entirely against this idea. And the idea is that you must wait until you're married, and only then can you have sex. And then some of them go on, as I said earlier, to say, and even then, even when you do have sex when you're married, you still, just for procreation, if there's some pleasure involved, well, we're uncomfortable with that, and maybe you really shouldn't enjoy it, but don't talk about that, just have babies. That kind of thing. Well, that's ridiculous. First of all, if you don't want to get married, then you shouldn't get married. It would be ridiculous, and you certainly shouldn't refrain from having sex. So fornication is this bad sounding word that religion came up with to stop people from having sex before marriage. But you should. So let's embrace fornication as a virtue. It's a good thing to have sex before marriage because sex is good. Pleasurable sex is good. So have sex before marriage. Also, if you're going to get married, you want to have sex with the person before you marry the person because you want to know whether you're really going to enjoy sex sufficiently to marry this person. You have no idea what sex is going to be like with someone until you engage with it. Sex with different people, it feels different. It's not all the same. And again, this is because of the spiritual and physical integration involved in this thing. So I'm a huge advocate of, and I think the facts of reality are a huge advocate of the idea that you should engage in sex before marriage. And just for the record, there's nothing in the fabric of the universe that says that you shouldn't have sex before you're married. That idea is just wholesale made up by religion. It's just complete fiction. So yes, engage in sex before marriage, engage in sex during marriage, and if you leave marriage and get divorced, engage in sex again outside of marriage. Sex is good. I want to say a few words on experimentation. Before I leave fornication, this is one of these things that's particularly nasty about religion, is that it makes young adults and teenagers feel guilty for pursuing what comes perfectly naturally to them, which is they become attracted to somebody based on mutual values, and they respect the person, and they admire the person, and they desire the person, and fall in love with the person perhaps, yet religion tells them no sex, no sex. Well, that's just cruel. And it in effect makes not children, but teenagers and young adults lie to their parents and their preachers because, of course, they're going to pursue this thing. The feelings and the desires are so strong, and they should violate the dogmas of religion and their parents, and they should lie to them if they need to about it, because the parents and the religionists have no business saying this stuff. Better yet, though, is to explain to your parents, if you're a young adult or a teenager listening, explain to your parents and the preachers that you think their views are nonsense, and ask them to support them with facts of reality, which they can't do. So now I want to move on to the idea of experimentation. We're not born knowing what's going to make us feel great sexually, and we're certainly not born knowing what's going to make our partners feel great sexually. We're not born knowing anything, much less how to engage in sex and what different things are going to make us feel good and what things are going to make us, what things we love, what things we don't love, and so on. So how do you find out? You experiment. You think about it. You come up with ideas. You try something, see how it works, see how it feels. Talk about it with your partner. Read some books on it. Get some sex toys if you want. Try different positions. Be creative. Experiment in sex. Sex is a beautiful, wonderful thing. We should experiment in sex in exactly the same way that we experiment in other important values in life. Obviously, maintaining the context that sex is all the things that I'm talking about here. This is a hugely important thing. But you don't just grab one kind of music and say, well, this is my kind of music, I'm going to listen to this forever. Try different things in sex. Talk to your partner about it, and say, well, what do you want to try? What interests you? Let's try this. Let's try that, and then see what feels good. And people don't experiment much in sex in large part because they're embarrassed about this whole topic because, again, religion has pushed this horrible bill of goods on people, and Kantian philosophy has done even worse. And so people are hesitant even to talk about it, much less experiment creatively in it. So I urge you to just experiment in sex. Talk to your partner and try new things and see what you come up with. You'll have a lot more fun. I want to say a few words now on how to make your sex life great. And here I want to break this in two parts, because you might not have a sex life yet. You might not have a partner at this time. And you might be married, you might be dating, you might be anywhere in between. So I'm going to break this into two things. If you don't have a partner yet, and if you do have a partner, how to improve your sex life. We'll start with if you don't have a partner. If you're without a sex partner right now, you should set aside, or think about setting aside, time every week to think about what you might do to find someone who you could begin a relationship with. And in other words, take this seriously. If you want to make your sex life great, you have to take it seriously. You have to make it an agenda on your list of things that you do in life. Sit down and think about, where can I go to meet people who might be the kind of person that I could start a relationship with. Get out and try new things. Take ballroom dancing lessons or Lindy lessons. Go rock climbing. Go take sailing lessons. Join a book club. Get out. If you don't have a lover, get out and meet new people and see if you can find someone who you could begin a relationship with. And when you do meet people, a good thing to talk about with new people, if you're interested in a romantic partner, is art. Art and romance are two of the areas in life that are sort of unified by the fact that what attracts us to people or to art is our sense of life. And if you're not familiar with that term, look up Ayn Rand's views on the concept of sense of life. A sense of life is basically a very deeply held emotional approach to life. And this expresses itself in people most in the kind of art that they like and in the kind of romantic partner that they like. And you even, as Ayn Rand says, what you fall in love with in large part in a person is his or her sense of life, this sort of emotional substratum that the person has that underlies everything that he or she thinks and does, and every gesture and everything. And that's what it is that we're first attracted to in someone, and what we kind of fall in love with. Well, if you speak with people about art, and if you find out, ask people, what are your favorite movies? What are your favorite novels? What television shows do you love? What music do you love? If you get on to these kinds of conversations, everybody likes to talk about these kinds of things. Stay away from politics and all of the hard stuff on your first dates. Talk to people about those kinds of values, art values, because you'll learn a lot about the person. And if you do have a lot of intersection in the art that you like, there's a good chance that you have compatible senses of life, and that's a good sign. So the main thing is take romance seriously, work to try to find somebody, and when you do meet people, try talking about art specifically. You can talk about other things too, but just this is one area that really does sort of pull out people's sense of life, and it can get conversations going in a good direction. Now, if you are in a relationship, I recommend something very similar, which is take time every week to talk to your partner about what you can do to continue making sex wonderful, to make it ever better. So talk about what you love, what you don't love, what you're interested in trying, what you thought about the last thing that you tried, and get creative and talk about new ways of doing things, and just make time for discussion. I'll say a personal word here. My wife and I have been doing this for some time, and it's really helpful. If you set aside time every week specifically to talk about sex, and the goal of the conversation is to talk about sex so that you can up the pleasure factor in it, and up the desire factor, and up everything in sex. If you make that effort and take it seriously, the result is profound. So take it seriously, make time every week, either to try to figure out how to find a romantic partner or to improve sex with your existing romantic partner. Take it seriously. If you're uncomfortable having this kind of conversation, by the way, with a romantic partner, that's all the more reason that you should do it. Because, again, you probably have some residual nonsense left in your soul from religion or from subjectivism or whatever that makes it sound like, oh, we shouldn't have to talk about this. But sex is a value. If it's a value that you can conceptualize and you can talk about things you like and dislike and plans for making things better, then obviously doing that is going to help you to improve your sex life. So I hope these ideas have been somewhat helpful, liberating at least. If you enjoyed today's episode, join me for the next episode of Craig Biddle Live. I try to do these every Wednesday. I miss them on occasion, but and if there's a particular question you'd like me to address, please drop it into the comments down below, or you can email questions to me at cbiddle@theobjectivestandard.com. Till next time, love your life and enjoy your sex.